So our next step here is this descent further into this trouble of modernity, which I will just most succinctly say is the death of the symbolic order in the most fundamental sense, which is the death of the civilizational ontos. Again, that this symbolic order is a civilizational vocabulary of consciousness, and it is the way in which consciousness is interfacing with the everyday. So it is what makes the bureaucratic, aristocratic, the status order of mankind, the cultural symbols, the metaphysical presumptions, as in religion or cosmogony. It makes all of these phenomena possible. So the loss of this symbolic order, the death of this symbolic order, as in modernity, is a total loss. And it is a loss because architecturally, this symbolic order of civilization, which is the long pre-modern history of Europe itself, hundreds, if not really thousands of year history of Europe, is no longer tenable. It's no longer functional. And this, again, as I have stated, is due to the new meta-architectural structure of civilization, as in a thermodynamic problem, as in a literal phase change in space-time by the harnessing of oil energy, electricity, which radically terraforms the condition not only locally but globally of mankind. So this is the tendrils of European modernity, and the crisis of European modernity, as in the death of symbolic order, become the global modern terrain, both through the pure brute force of colonization, but also through this industrial technological phase change transformation, which is embedded and latent within the Western philosophical civilizational architecture, which is a total standing orderization of life and nature through the scientific technological conversion, which is a movement into the grounds of the earth to find the energetic unit, which of course culminates in the 20th century, again with the atom bomb and with nuclear power and fusion. So again, a replication of the powers of the sun or the star, and of course you have the famous Oppenheimer quote, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds." This is about power, and this is the pursuit of Western civilizational history, in large part human history, and of course becomes the collapse of modernity, that the actual physical lived and living power in human hands has now surpassed this pre-modern agrarian theology, which is the symbolic order in which life is made operative or meaningful or conscious, behavioral in space and in time. It's the ethics and morality. It is the ground of human behavior, or the human faculty of relationship to being. We discussed this with the poets, and now we're moving into surrealism as this psychological pursuit, which is the collapse, again, in the collapse of the symbolic order. The terrain of the human experience falls inwards somatically. And so we've concerned ourselves already with existential disclosure. We've concerned ourselves already with symbolic order collapse, as in Weimar Republic. We've described the forces which draw the human being into this intimate dialectical relationship with the self, because all other structures, which are the fail-safes before this descent, fail. And we have what I would say is a critical relationship to André Breton, the Manifesto of Surrealism, and the destruction of the rational censored life and this fall into the dream space, which is the unconscious association. The historical catastrophe, which is World War I, industrialized mass death, collapse of the bourgeois rational confidence, the Enlightenment, and then a total fragmentization of self and a mechanization of consciousness in the industrial technological order, which is the exponential growth of this standing orderization of nature into unit, number, and name. And this descent is beneath the conscious control. So into this irrational space, which is simultaneously the existential confrontation with the self, as in Beckett or Lispector, just as much as it is the sediment of consciousness itself, which is a lived experience. And so we haven't really gone into Freud here or Boltzmann or Maxwell, because that isn't the theme of the project, and it isn't the concern of the project. It is the concern of the subject or subjectivity or consciousness, that the seeing and perceiving and experience of living being is primary and primacy itself, and that from that emerges various different symbolic orders and strands of abstraction which go deep into the fabric of science and mathematics, but is fundamentally experienced at the level of the experience of the individual, which keeps us at the surrealism of the dream space or the dream state, or cognition and consciousness itself, this real exploration, not formalization, as in Freud. And this process of direct confrontation with the ontos, which is, of course, the existentialist experience, that we are asking the question of what is being in relation to being? What is the lived and living experience? And this is simultaneously inclusive of science, but not exclusive of the direct kind of Jobian confrontation, which we've discussed. That what we experience with Hegel, and this is what's so critical, we have Hegel's emergence in the time of Shelley, that history is a dynamic process of dialectical relationship, that it is unfolding through contradiction and contraction in the space between the experience of consciousness and becoming conscious and the architectural space of the world, which is to say the transformation of industrial technological modernity as it is at the level of the sexually reproductive ground of recognition of the self, which forms the fabric of everyday life, which is deeply connected to Breton and the exploration of the unconscious, that the human relationship to disclosure of being, which is existence itself, this relationship, as it unfolds in time, changes history. That history itself is a permeable membrane in which consciousness and the change of consciousness makes possible evolutions in the terrain. And a century later, a century after Hegel, which is the time of Breton, the fracture of modernity, the death of the symbolic order, Dada and the Weimar Republic, we have perhaps the greatest historical definition, which is warned of by Nietzsche, Marx, and I guess we can just keep it there. Warned of by Nietzsche and Marx as this terraforming or terraformization of the human being relationship to being itself. The literal terrain of what is possible in existence has shifted due to this thermodynamic revolution, which is industrial technology, but also the bottoming out of the civilizational ontos, which creates this descent into being itself as in an exploration of the unconscious, or the exploration of the existential condition, Jobian condition of man in relation to nature. And this is a terraforming which is simultaneously existential, psychological, historical, political, symbolic, etc. And this is all related to the ontos and the human relation to ontos, the death of the the mythic or the ancient structures which were possible in a closed environment, which is to say a local, regional, energetically limited and low energy environment, which explodes in modernity into a global situation of becoming conscious, right? In terms of the exchange of energy and information by train, plane, car, or digital space, that this is a collapse of that which holds the surfeit substance of the symbolic order of modernity. And then we descend in this dialectical relationship of the change of technology. I've called this channel 1 and channel 2. Channel 1 being the information technology of the genome as it evolves through deep time, and then channel 2 being the exponential growth of information technology over the 20th into the 21st centuries. That this prosthetic of symbol, as in literature, the printing press, or even code, that this prosthetic is in real time changing the situation of human beings' relationship to itself, which is critical to the Hegelian dialectic of history. That when this gape emerges through contraction or contradiction, there is a descent in modernity, as predicted really by Hegel's architectural infrastructure of metaphysics, into the real solution space of the human being, which is metaphysical certainty supposed by religious orders, civilizational narratives, etc. When this metaphysical certainty disappears, what is there? So this is a descent into the ground, which is familiar to Advaita Vedanta in the ancient Hindu tradition. It's the stripping of the layers of the garments of consciousness, so to speak, which are narrative dependencies, a civilizational or religious narrative, a narrative of self, down into the substrate, which is a thermodynamic and thermonuclear process of becoming and unfolding, which is a deep time revolution and evolution of forms. So Hegel, in this sense, is prescient to Darwin in his unveiling and unfolding the metaphysical process, which Darwin makes explicit in evolutionary phenomenon, which is a thermodynamic phenomenon fundamentally in terms of energetic transformation. But the critical aspect of surrealism here is consciousness actually undergoing the reality of this experience, particularly in civilizational transition, which is the modern bottoming out of the symbolic order, the death of the symbolic order. And this death of the symbolic order is critically necessary, and it is essential to existential thought, as it is to the Advaita Vedanta, which is to say a critical collapse of categories. It's actually fundamentally in relationship to science and mathematics for this reason, because it is in relationship to abstraction and the literal somatic lived condition of the human body in space and in time, which is to say the beating heart of the thermodynamic being as a energetic information technology structure experiencing itself recursively as a universal process. And so this descent with surrealism and the necessity of entering the dream space and the fracture of modernity, this psychological process of becoming conscious of this fracture, is a neurosomatic lived felt experience of the death of the ground, which was formerly the neural pathway of being in time, which is to say the civilizational order, or the byt, as Mayakovsky puts it again, the everyday, which is the destabilization of the total architectural terrain, which was a metaphysical certainty. And this is destroyed processually in an exponential becoming, which is industrial modernity, Darwin, mechanization, the alienation which Marx describes in relationship to the machine as a labor system, the mass warfare of World War I, urbanization, city centers, this terraforming of the sun-moon atavistic relationship with nature, which was codified in the stories of pre-modern Europe. Again, innovations such as photography, cinema, radio, psychoanalysis, technological acceleration itself. All of these innovative processes are described by Hegel meta-architecturally, as that which is tearing at the foundations of what was formerly conceived of to be possible, which was the existing solution space. And it's a condensation of space and time in which the human being is forced into a confrontation via the collapse of the civilizational ontos with the unstable reality of being, unstable subjectivity, unstable history. The ground which formerly made pre-modern Europe possible was simultaneously the ground that needed to be pulled away, or was pulled away, to create this confrontation through symbolic rupture. And that if rational civilization produces Verdun and mechanized slaughter, as is described and detailed in Gross or Dies, what is beneath the corruption, decadence, and destruction of the emptying out of the possibility of meaningful being, which is manifest quite clearly in the destabilization of the economic and political circumstances of modernity. That it is no longer possible to meaningfully be, and that being itself has been thrown into protracted crisis. Not only is meaning in question, but the possibility of being itself is deeply in question in terms of this mass death and destruction calamity, which includes the Spanish flu, and it includes tuberculosis. This is a total throwing of being into chaos. So what is beneath it is the question of what is the transformation of history and the transformation of consciousness in time, which is, again, as I've stated, not only a genetic thermonuclear deep time process of sexual recombination, which changes the neural structure of being and the somatic structure of being, which is a disclosure possibility. Sophistication through evolution creates the possibility of disclosure of being itself through itself as a recursive phenomenon. But also that this recursive phenomenon, in relation to the technological and scientific products that it throws off in this ontological pursuit, which I suggest all of life is the pursuit of being conscious of itself, that this process is itself the destabilization of the grounds of history through which we must read history. And this is deeply Hegelian, and this was understood by the Surrealists and understood by Breton as being a critical facet and aspect of what is coming of modernity. And we see this destabilization in everything from Dada to the new objectivity to the existentialist literature, that this process is being underwent by the individual because the civilizational ontos has utterly collapsed the collective possibility, which was the pre-modern mythical thread. And this is a total descent somatically into the wilderness of that which pre-modern civilization availed protection from, which is exposure, ontological exposure to being itself in the full danger and the full breadth of the magnitude of what is at question and what is at hand, which I would again say is Jobian as much as it is Dante. The descent into the wilderness, and Virgil being the guide as he descends into the hell of the corrupt architecture of his time to understand this descent into hell. We've gone into it deeply in terms of the enonic, katabatic process of life and civilizations, which is the process of discovering in a lived, felt, embodied way what is being. Again, deeply poetic. It cannot be symbolically translated, but the poetic function of thinking and languaging makes this process and this critical meta infrastructure legible in history. It's fundamentally asymbolic. But the decadence of the symbol is itself what produces this phenomenon of civilizational collapse, in that abstraction rends the human being from this essential channel one informational technological process of the genome becoming recursive to itself, but at the same time reveals the critical ontological gap of the civilizations, tribes, and communal structures therein prior via this energetic phase change and transformation. This energetic phase change and transformation is one of increased possibility in space and time. So when I'm saying low energy civilizations or low energy tribes, I'm discussing space and time bound infrastructure, which is slow infrastructure and limited infrastructure, which is constraint. This is a constraint problem, and the human being itself is solving the constraint problem of being in time in a thermodynamically limited form, exposed to entropy, and has a period of degradation. And this is being solved through science and medicine at all times, because it is a question of literal survival and persistence of the organism. Food, water, shelter, etc. And that this existential problem expanded in space is the civilizational problem, and expanded in deep space and deep time is the cosmological problem of the persistence of any given architecture or form itself in an entropic universe. All of which are pseudo-closed boundaries, which are leaking energy, leaking heat in time. This is being in time itself, the river of time. And that this destabilization is the predicate upon which cosmological being is founded. Again, I'll return to Percy Shelley here. The meta-architecture of Prometheus Bound or Prometheus Unbound in relation to Aeschylus is the question of the human being itself is in constraint, that the body, the blood, the mind, that this pseudo-contained or pseudo-bound form is in space and in time in a limited function. How do you liberate the thermonuclear energy beneath the human being, which is itself and all things? And simultaneously, what Shelley and Blake diagnose at the root of British Empire is the symbolic order as chains upon the possibility of being acting in time, as in being human, the real solution space and constraint possibility of being human, as it has been corralled, colonized, subordinated by this symbolic code, which is the British Empire of status, power, affect, patrilineage, etc. And so the entirety of Shelley's political theory and political ontology is derived from his understanding of constraint at a cosmological level, which is deeply tied to my work as it is to Spinoza. It is the understanding of the cosmology of being itself, the disclosure of the ontos, which is fundamentally the poetic act of being in relation to itself, which then downstream is articulated by Shelley as a railing against marriage or slavery or any of these other separative, possessive, controlling state or religious level systems and institutions which discourage disclosure and discourage the liberation of this thermonuclear energy of being itself in time as the full possibility of the expression of what it is not only to be human, but to be a being in relation to being, which is fundamentally a human. And this is the issue that we experience that Shelley is prescient of and that Hegel is describing in this collapse 100 years later from their time into World War I, which is the fracturing of this static holding cell process of empires, which dissolves into the nation-state world and dissolves into the industrial technological world as a phase change. And in this opening of the space, there is Surrealism, Dadaism, the new objectivity, existentialist literature, which is into the opening, the possibility of ontological disclosure heightens. Because the chaos of state control, the state control, bourgeois order, these systems of rationality and the deception of the Enlightenment mind or Enlightenment thought has collapsed. And this is what you see so clearly in Dada. It's that the symbol itself has been broken. It doesn't make sense anymore. It's descended into nonsense. And this is critical in understanding technological modernity and what happens in the Weimar Republic and what happens with Surrealism. It's that the rational order of the symbolic infrastructure of civilization in Western history, European ontology, has fractured irrevocably in this phase change. And what emerges from it is a descent somatically into the self, the lived experience of being, which is a thermonuclear process, which can't be held by any inherited symbolic order. And this is incredibly dangerous to empire, which is why we see Shelley censored or Kafka censored, or Baudelaire censored, because what is being revealed is the underside of this symbolic process, which is an architecture of discrimination. It's a hierarchy of discrimination, which is to say a symbolic order is the imposition of a value system upon life, which is chaining life or corralling life to a certain set of structural processes or ways of being in the world, and that beneath this process, which is civilization, or beneath this process, which is being human, which is Breton and the Surrealist descent into dreams, or the Dadaist descent into the death of the symbolic order, or the Existentialist descent into the ancient process of recovering the ontos, which is common to Heraclitus, even as it is to Lispector, that these descents are all descents into the critical existential reality of being human, which is being in relation to being, which is itself the only real or meaningful pursuit in life, because it is the pursuit of life towards life, which is recursion. And this is what Hegel is suggesting in his philosophy of history. It's that the movement of being in time is a dialectical relationship to the unfolding of this possibility, and how the unfolding of this possibility actually shapes the world and sculpts history. That Boltzmann or Maxwell or Planck or Spinoza themselves are dialectical actors in this historical process of changing architectural relation of being in time, which is the literal terraforming and then ultimately the superstructural paradigm shifting phase change of the energetic transformation of modernity, which again is thermonuclear and oil-based, electricity-based, the car, the plane, and then of course the digital space itself, which is an energetic infrastructure which is being held up behind the scenes by energetic transformation, just as the human genome is, which is the neural possibility and responsiveness of consciousness to disclosure. That what Hegel is saying in the most revolutionary way beneath the philosophy of history is that being is already ontologically and cosmologically in dialectical relationship to itself, even just in the narrow space of the human being, as in it is an information technology which makes possible recursion, which makes possible existential reflective thought, as Kierkegaard describes as dialectical redoubling. It is the process of being reflecting upon itself through the information technology of the genome, which is the cutting edge of the human brain and the human soma, which is the advent of the forebrain and the hundreds of thousands of years of the process of the sophistication of that, which makes possible philosophy, which makes possible Enlightenment theory and Enlightenment philosophy, which makes possible the coming of Da Vinci or Shelley in terms of unifying the ontos through disclosure and the refusal of disciplinary bounds. These Renaissance minds which themselves permeate and penetrate to the heart of the matter, using every single possible disciplinary descent available to them and the unification of these disciplines into a structural realization of what is the character and identity of being itself. This is critical. Understanding this is not only understanding deep time, but one of just my favorite and fascinating things to pursue, which is the catastrophe of modernity, the crisis of modernity, because it is the crisis which is experienced first by the poet as a somatic separation, as described by Sartre and Nausea, I think, by far the best. It is the lived, felt condition of ineluctable separation from the ontos, and the terror and the destruction and the calamity as in dissociation from the ontos, which is dissociation from being itself, and what this creates in modernity as a global tone and a global affect of meaninglessness, beinglessness, the existential dread or the hollow man or the wasteland of T.S. Eliot, that is being described as the literal structure of being in the world has been ruptured to the point of which there is no relationship. And this, of course, is a total affect and a total condition which is across scales, is everything from the human being to the human being to the human being to nature, to a lived felt sense of what it is to be alive or in existence, to know that, and to have a relationship to being God or nature at all whatsoever. And this is, again, the question that Heidegger asks in 1936 and 1937 as he begins his relationship to Hölderlin. And this profound failure and profound loss in history is perhaps, as a Hegelian would say, necessary because of what is made possible through industrial technological modernity as an expansion of the solution space, which ruptures the dream thread or the dream narrative network of the local low-energy civilization or tribe, the pre-modern ontos. And so that this scaffolding, which I've described quite clearly as scientific revolution at the level of theory, then put into practice via the assembling of various different technologies and information technologies. And I think Fermi is perhaps the greatest example in modernity of this phenomenon. His theory work in quantum mechanics and then his assembly and work on the Chicago pile, that this process of the scaffolding of this Channel 2 architecture, which is symbolic architecture, which is maths, science, literature, these are all symbolic codes as well as philosophy. And Shelley understands this very clearly. This symbolic architecture is scaffolding faster than the Channel 1 architecture, which is the slow evolutionary genomic architecture of sexual recombination, which is the code or codex of being human. This evolutionary process is hundreds of thousands and millions of years of changing in time, which is the advent of the forebrain and the development of the nervous system. But this Channel 2 information technology, which is to say science, industrial revolution, and digital revolution, this architecture is exponentially evolving. And this is widening the critical gap between the lived somatic experience of being in relation to disclosure, which is, in the somatic sense, I say sun and moon, as to say it's bound to neural time and natural time, time of nature, time of light, time of gleaming, which is a Hölderlinian time. And then Heidegger asks across the gap of modernity, what does it mean to exist in factory time and seek to recover the gods, which themselves are the enfolded relationship of being to itself in this natural sense, which is embodied, somatic, lived, felt. The loss of this relationship is the critical gap of modernity, which is the descent into dissociative, violent chaos and overturning, because the lived experience, the somatic experience, has been replaced by the alienation of industrial technology and the collapse of the narrative myths, which themselves governed this pre-modern atavistic world. And then there is a descent, instead of and outside of the cultural myth, into the subjective myth, which is the dream, the psychic fracture. And then furthermore, the existential confrontation with the ontos itself as a lived, embodied phenomenon. Which is why I suggest that Dostoevsky or Kafka or Trackle are telling us something deeper than science can tell us, even as science changes our world materially and phenomenologically. They're telling us what it means to be in relationship to being itself outside of the symbolic infrastructure of civilization, the architectural brevity of history itself, which is the change in time of all of humanity, whether that's through ancient Egypt or India, into the factory time of England or the United States, or the condensation of Germany into urban units, that there is the experience outside of this time, which is the timeless, made possible through genomic and neural evolution relationship to being. And this burst that we have of existentialism, surrealism, Dadaism, new objectivity is the psychic fracture made political condition, lived, felt, existential condition, whereas perhaps, I've said this before, the descent experience of Shelley into the ontos is driven by the passion of the Renaissance mind. But into this cavern and into this break of the Weimar Republic and the German and the European existential and ontological condition of relationship to being itself, which is an architectural transformation, which is a paradigm shift transformation in the energetics of Western civilization. This occurrence is itself what creates this massive bottoming out and this massive creative thrust, which is literary, visual, artistic, etc., because reality itself has now entered into political dispute. This is no longer the private existential project of the occasional Renaissance mind, but it is instead the collective opening up of the ontological ground, the chasm, the gape, which is now a mass wound of rupture, anxiety, absurdity, and estrangement, made totalizing, unignorable, and undeniable at the level of lived felt economics, politics, and the possibility of survival, the throwing of civilization into the depths of this chaos and absurdity and violence, is itself a mass somatic condition which Artaud is describing as the 20th century progresses as a possession, that humanity or Western civilization has become possessed without a finding of the true ontological root ground of human being relationship to being, which is the possibility of being in time at all whatsoever meaningfully. Artaud is asking the same question Heidegger is asking, but with an urgency, somatic urgency, that we don't necessarily experience in the intellectual remove of Heidegger. Now, this is not to say that Heidegger isn't having a somatic experience of being, otherwise he wouldn't be asking that question. But for Artaud, the urgency is fundamental because Artaud cannot exist or cannot continue forth without that relationship. So it is pursued with the agony and the ecstasy and the passion of one who is deep into modernity, yet without the necessary infrastructural scaffolding, architectural scaffolding, to create the leap, which is the relationship between the time of Spinoza, Shelley, and Hegel to the integration of the nervous system with astrophysics, which is necessary. This is what's so fascinating about science and technology is Shelley understands this, is that these are critical methods and modes by which to examine being and to refine and clarify ontological architecture. And Hegel would also understand this as the historical dialectical process of refining ontological disclosure until being is made apparent, which would be described as the singularity, so to speak, the oneness of Spinoza or the monad of Leibniz, that this being itself is made apparent in character and identity, as I've described in the operator identity and persistence architecture of existence itself, that to make being apparent then downstream is the ontological surgery and remedy of the perpetual architectural dissolution and symbolic and ontological rupture of civilizations time and time again in the face of that which is, which has not been accurately summed into ontological ground, which is itself the myth structure, or the cosmology, or the cosmogony of any given civilization. And so these insurrections into the ground, whether that's Freud or Hegel or Breton and the Surrealists or the Existentialists, these are all attempts in different degrees of penetration into the functional matter of being itself, whether that is the consciousness, unconsciousness, ontological disclosure, as in Hölderlin, the relationship to nature's gleaming, which is perceived by the poet and articulated as such. What is this mystery, which itself has been formalized or synthesized in the world's myth, which has been destroyed? These world's myths have been destroyed by the phase change of modernity, the paradigm shift of modernity, which requires a higher resolution, high energy informational ontos, which can now compatibly integrate Fermi or Planck or Boltzmann or Maxwell or industrial technology or factory time, this entirely synthetic environment which has been sculpted by the human hand as a mass informational technology, as a way of being in time, which has utterly shifted by this opening up of this energetic field, which is the paradigm shift, which is now intimate relationship to history. It's the sedimentary ground of reality now. It is a new historical movement and transformation which could not be assimilated by the pre-modern ontological architecture, and thus it collapses. So when we're talking about civilizational collapse, we're talking about ontological collapse. It is the collapse of the meta-structural and meta-architectural relationship to being in time, which is itself the formalization of Enlightenment philosophy or Enlightenment ideologies into civilizational architecture, which fracture under the weight of the burden of the literal phase change that is brought about by science and technology and industry. And this fracturing is the gate or the chasm of the abyss into which life falls in. This is the chaos of the turn of the age of empires and czars to nation states, and the fragmentation even as the nation state is created in the real problem of condensing global modernity, which is a time-space phase change in possibility. The jet plane, the bullet train, the digital space, artificial intelligence, these are all condensations into higher degrees of abstraction, which make possible informational technological communication across wide swaths of space and time, such as reading an ancient Indian scroll via the internet. Or meeting someone across the world instantaneously via a video call. And what does this do to, this is a lived possibility. It's a somatic, economical possibility of energetic and information exchange. And what does this do to the ontological grounds which civilizations are constructed? And these grounds are always already provisional unless they are founded upon a true ontology. And what I'm suggesting is that critical method has never existed in human history. We've never had a unified ontos, other than in the intuitions, I would say, of Heraclitus, which are now, and maybe perhaps Abhidhamma in the Kashmiri Shaivism tradition. These intuitions, which are now being deepened and clarified and formalized in a very microscopic way by scientific pursuit. And I've brought up the connection between the operator identity, which I've formalized, and understanding that dissipative structures by Prigogine actually share the precisely the same structural realization. To understand the ontos, we must incorporate everything. And this is the issue of exponentially growing technology and scientific pursuit as it booms in the 19th century onward. That a critical ontology must necessarily develop, clarify, and enlighten, clear these grounds by incorporating everything. And this is why we lose the Renaissance mind in a modern sense, because there is exponentially more to incorporate than ever before. And this is seen in the population growth of the 20th century. This is seen in the disciplinary siloing, the existential alienation, which is experienced throughout the 19th and 20th century. Marx is describing this phenomenon metastructurally, economically, and politically. The possibility in the solution space of the human being has exponentially grown. Condensation of space and time, making available more energy. And this has actually changed clarification of the ontos. So when I speak about Shelley and Prometheus Unbound, or I speak about Heraclitus, they are solving for a different problem in history, but itself in the timeless sense, the problem of being is the same. So you can read Heraclitus or Prometheus Unbound through a thermodynamic astrophysical lens, and it's coherent because it's a structural revelation and disclosure of being itself through the language and languaging possibilities of the time, which is to say the informational technology available in every single disciplinary silo, which is being synthesized, formalized in relationship to the ontological disclosure of the poet or the philosopher toward being itself. And these disclosures, descents, which I'm describing in Surrealism, Existentialism, etc. These are all descents that are being underwent by the individual in relationship to being itself. And this fracture of modernity is the fracture of the civilizational collective code, the ontological code which held up the low energy grounds of closed civilizations and tribes, time immemorial, in a pre-modern sense, in an atavistic sense. Tribes, ancient civilizations, etc. These are held and bound and embodied by these ontological codes, which are cosmological and cosmogenic codes, or cosmogonic codes. This is ruptured irrevocably by the industrial, technological, and scientific revolutions of modernity, which fracture down to the level of the individual, which is precisely why we experience individualism and subjectivity as such fraught ground in modernity, and it continues to exponentially become fraught. Down to the level of the individual, these ontological myths and narratives break because there has been a phase change in consciousness itself. What is possible in the solution space of the neural somatic embodied body, regardless of whether or not that is a highly sensitive body such as Shelley. This solution space has fundamentally changed at the ground, at the physical ground of existence itself, the embodied physical ground, the thermodynamic ground of existence itself. And as such, the total collapse of world myth. Again, this is not just the West. This is the East. This is the entirety of world history. The total collapse of this ground has thrown being in upon itself in the alienation, collapse, ecstatic terror, absurdity, historical fracture, and dream instability inside the body itself. This is an entirely different mode of truth transmission. It is an entirely phase-changing mode of human history of relationship to being itself. The existential philosophical literature is now the lived experience of every human being on Earth because of this phase change. And there has been no consolidation ontologically of being itself. There has been no possible consolidation. This eruption has fragmented and fractured down to the level of the closed, somatic, integral, internal experience of the individual itself toward disclosure, which has always been the poetic, shamanic condition of descent, as in Dante. That every modern human being themselves is a Dante towards ontological disclosure, or a Job towards ontological disclosure, which is to say the myth has broken absolutely. And that to cling to the myth is to cling to a former phase, which is to say there was a liquid or a solid history which has become gas. That this dialectical rupture, which Hegel describes a century before it really solidifies and occurs as a critical part of his infrastructural theory of history. This rupture is now in the synthetic process at the level of the individual being thrown in upon the somatic, neurological experience, embodied experience of being. And this is why I return to surrealism or existentialism, because these are ways into the ground which are asymbolic. In that this asymbolic unity of being is something that has been time immemorial, as in the ancient Greek poets, which is relationship to nature, an enfolded relationship into nature. But this is something that now is of the critical, global, integrative, and integral importance and possibility. Because the closed, low-energy world of the atavistic sun-moon ontology of pre-modern creation and the myths and narratives therein has been irrevocably broken. Now what is left and what we have, which is a historically unprecedented phase change, is this intensified and intense condensation of time and space. And a being thrown in upon itself absolutely in the death of civilizations and in the death of the symbolic order, not only of Western civilization, but of world civilization and world history, which requires a disclosure of being itself, an existential confrontation of being itself, which is fundamentally ahuman. It is beyond the human and into the deep cosmology of thermonuclear existence itself, down through the genome, even into that which was before the genome. The energetic state and faculty of creation itself, the process of creation moving through deep time, which formulates the existential neurological somatic experience of the human being as a brief mode, as a phase change transference of energy down through evolutionary scales of time and change and recombination. The creation of various different fleshly modes by which to comprehend through disclosure the actual recursive experience of being itself, the structure of being itself, cosmologically, from bird to tree to plant to star to galaxy to cell to the human being with ears, eyes, nose, mouth, liver, lungs, heart, and brain, forebrain and hindbrain. ancient deep time. And this disclosure is the cellar. It's the bottoming out. It's the existential ancestral foundation of creation itself. This moment of confrontation is a utter horror. It's a subliminal, a sublime revelation out from under all of the presumed symbolic codes and narrative stories and myths, because it is real. And this reality is disclosure of being itself. It's the existential confrontation of being itself with being itself. The facing of what and who one is at root. The true subjectivity of nature and creation and existence itself. The total natural aspect of being itself, which is gleaming forth beneath the mask of apparent things and narrative myths, which have crumbled in modernity, collapsed in the death of the symbolic order. Thank you.